Hello friends, welcome to my next video. This is my fifth video. So the today's topic will be REST APIs. As I said in my previous video that in next video we will discuss about REST APIs, that how REST APIs works and what is the actual work of APIs in Spring Boot application. So first we will see that what is REST APIs. So before moving on that topic, first we have to understand that how a Spring Boot application works. What is the basic functional concept of Spring Boot application? That how a client interact with our Spring Boot project. Then what is the inner functionality of the Spring Boot application? So first we will see that part, and then we will move to our REST APIs. We will we will do a coding. We will create a Spring Boot application. Okay, and with the help of the Spring Boot application, we will see that how our REST APIs work. Okay, so let's start. So in Spring Boot application, what happens? Uh, we create a Spring Boot application. Okay, suppose this is our Spring Boot application. Okay, suppose this is our Spring Boot application. Okay, and let's assume that this is our client or this is the front end part. Okay, this is the front end part. Front end, or let's assume this is our client or customer, whatever is you can say. Okay, this is our front end. So this front end can be designed in various programming languages like React, JSP, Teamlib. Okay, so this front end can be designed in various programming languages like React, JSP, Teamlib, whatever. Okay, or HTML. So this is the front end part. Okay, now in Spring Boot there are various layers. Okay, layers means in this we will code, in this Spring Boot application we will code multiple layers. We will create multiple layers. Okay, so the first layer will be the controller layer. Okay, this is our controller layer. Okay, this is our controller layer, and the second layer we will design in our Spring Boot application will be nothing but service layer. Okay, and the third and most important part is our repository layer. I will explain that what is the use of this all layer one by one. Okay, first we will see the basics that how these layers work. Okay, this is our repository layer. Okay, so there can be multiple layer. Okay, based on your, it all depend on your project. If you are making your simple project like a CRUD operation, then you have normally these layers: controller layer, service layer, and repository layer. If you are creating a big project, there can be a util layer or HTTP layer, or whatever your project wants. Okay, so you put all the layers in your project, but basically if you want to create a simple CRUD project, then you need only these layers: control layer, service layer, and repository layer. Okay, so we will discuss the work of every layer. So first of all, what is controller layer? First we will see controller layer. Okay, so as the name suggests, controller means to control. Okay, in our controller layer, in our in our controller layer, we will define the endpoints or API. Okay, so the concept of REST API that we will code or will see in this video. So all this coding we will write in our controller layer. Okay, so all the endpoints, all the APIs we will code in our controller layer. Basically, the controller layer in Spring Boot is responsible for handling the incoming HTTP request. Okay, it handles the incoming HTTP requests from the client. Client is nothing but the front end or the front end part. Suppose the client wants to retrieve some data, okay, from the database or our backend. Suppose our this is our database. This is our database. Suppose the client want to retrieve some data from our database. Okay, suppose the client wants to retrieve some data from our database. So what will happen? It will go first, the client interact with our controller part. Okay, in controller we will define our REST APIs. Okay, it handles the request, all the incoming request coming from the client, and and it will return the response back to the client. Okay, so how a controller responds back to the client? So when the incoming request is coming from the client, it will goes to our controller layer. In controller layer, we will define our endpoints or APIs, and then the controller layer will communicate with the service layer. Okay, so what is service layer? Service layer. What is service layer? So service layer is nothing but basically in service layer we will define our business logics. All the business logic is defined in the service layer. Means how to retrieve data from the database, or if the incoming request is coming from the controller, then how to handle it, how to give data back to the controller. All these things we will write in our service layer. Okay, and then after the service layer will ask the data from the repository layer. Okay, so what is the repository layer? What is the work of repository layer? So we will repository layer is nothing but it will it connect it it is connected to our database, and whenever a service layer calls him, then it get some data from the database and returns back to the service layer. Okay, so repository layer is nothing but it is connected to the database. So when there is an incoming request from the service layer, then repository layer goes to the database and returns data to the repository layer, and repository layer further pass the data to the service layer, and the service layer pass the data to the controller layer, and then the controller pass as a response to the customer. So this is the request coming from the client side, and this is the response which is returning by the controller layer. Okay, so there are many requests there are many requests which is done by the client. So suppose customer wants to retrieve the data from the database, so it will goes to the request layer, so it will goes to the controller layer. In controller layer we will put a mapping which is known as get mapping. Okay, if it is used to get the data from the database. Okay, suppose the client wants to get some data from database, so in controller we will write the get mapping. So with the help of get method, we can get the data from the database. Suppose client wants to update some data. Okay, client want to update some data from the database. So in controller layer we'll write update method or update mapping, update put mapping. If client wants to update some data from the database. Okay, so this is the working of put mapping. And suppose client wants to delete some data. So in our controller layer, we will write a map, we will write a code, or we will write a HTTP method whose name is delete mapping. Okay, so with the help of delete mapping, client can delete the data from the database. Okay, and suppose if client wants to get mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, suppose clients wants to send some data. We had seen get, put and delete, and if the client wants to send some data to the database, then we will write a HTTP method in our controller layer which will be post mapping. Okay, so with the help of post mapping, client can send the data to the database. Okay, so these are the four main things. Okay, main functional part of the controller layer, with the help of which a controller layer can communicate with the service layer, and the service layer communicate with repository layer, and the repository layer communicate with the database, and database returns the data to service layer, and then from service layer the data goes to controller layer, and then the controller return the data as a response to the client. So this is nothing but this is the REST APIs which we are discussing. REST APIs. Okay, this is nothing but this is the REST APIs. So what is REST APIs? Here comes a question that okay, you explained that what is get mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, post mapping. So these are the REST APIs. So what is the REST APIs? So REST. Okay, REST stands for representational state transfer APIs. Okay, so it stands for representational state transfer APIs. So what is the main function of REST APIs. So REST APIs is nothing but REST APIs are used to communicate. It is used to communicate with the other software or other website to get the data from the other websites. Okay, it is used to communicate with other website or other database. Okay, so REST is nothing but is a representational state transfer APIs which is used to communicate with the other softwares. Okay, suppose you want to get some data from the other software, so the two software will communicate with the help of APIs. So API. So API is nothing but it stands for application application programming programming interface. Okay, it is used to communicate with the other softwares. Okay, so this is the meaning of our REST APIs. REST means representational state transfer API and API means application programming interface used to communicate with the other software. Okay, so now we will go deeper. Okay, we will see in deep that what is this REST APIs. So it is a way. So REST API is nothing but it is a way for client and server to communicate over the internet. Okay, it is used to communicate with the client and server. This is nothing but this is our client. Okay, this is nothing but this is our server. So it is used to communicate with the this is our database. Okay, this is our database and this is our server which we are creating Spring Boot application. Okay, so it is a way for client and it is a way to communicate with the client and server using standard HTTP method. HTTP methods are nothing but the get mapping, put mapping, delete mapping and post mapping. It treats everything as a resource and each resource is represented by a unique URL. Okay, if in next video we will see the coding part of this REST APIs. So in which we will see that if you want to get some data from the database, so you will write like this at the rate get mapping and in bracket you have to define the path. Suppose slash product. Okay, slash product. So this is nothing but this is the URL. This get mapping is the HTTP methods and the this part which is written in bracket it is a URL part. If you hit this URL in your Postman is nothing but Postman is a tool which is used to test APIs if that API is working properly or not. Okay, so if you hit this URL, then the client get all the data which he wants to retrieve. Okay, suppose if suppose if client wants if client want that, so I need I need only data whose ID is 1. Okay, so here we have to pass the ID. Okay, if the if we write this code in our controller, then if the client hits this URL, then he will get the unique data. Okay, unique data means the ID which is written passed here. He will get the all the data whose ID is 1. Okay, so this is the our get mapping part. Now the another HTTP method is our post mapping. Post mapping. Okay, post mapping. In post mapping, you have to do same that you have done in get mapping. You have to pass your URL. Suppose products post mapping. Okay, suppose you have written either post method. Okay, in post mapping, what happens when a client wants to send data to the other software or the database? So we use post mapping in our controller part. So if you want to send data from the postman, then we will pass a JSON format data. Okay, so data, suppose you want to pass ID will should be 1, and if you want to send your name, okay, then the name, suppose the name is laptop, and suppose you want to send price, then the price will be suppose 50,000. Okay, so suppose you want to send this data. Okay, so you will write post mapping. Okay, and in URL, if you hit this URL, then your data will be sent to the database, and it will store in the form of Java object. Okay, so for storing or for converting the JSON data to the Java object, okay, we will use a annotation. We will use a annotation here, which is iterate request request body. Okay, helps to it helps to convert JSON data to Java object. Okay, once if you go if once if you see the practical, then you will understand that how things are all these things will work. Okay, we had seen our two HTTP methods. That first is our get mapping. If the client want to send some data to the other software, you get the data from the software or the database, then we will use slash product, and HTTP method is get mapping. And suppose client wants to get some specific data or some unique data from the database, then he will pass an ID to the server or the database, there from where he can get the unique value. If client wants to send some data to the server, other server or other software, then he will use post mapping. If he hit this URL slash post method and suppose he is passing this data, then this data is passed to the other software, or we have to use a direct request body which used to convert this JSON data to the Java object. We are passing here the JSON data, but in the other side it will store as a Java object. Okay, so this is the post mapping. Now the third one is at the rate delete mapping. We have to use same here. Suppose wants to delete product. Here you can also use a product. Suppose you wants to send product, then you hit the product part. If you want to get product, you simply click the get product. Okay, but remember one thing, you have to use correct HTTP method. Suppose you want to get some data, then you have to get right here get HTTP method. If you want to post some data, then you have to write post mapping. If you want to delete some data, you have to delete mapping, but the URL will remain same. It depends on you that what you want to write here in the URL. So it is not a big deal. Okay, suppose you want to delete data. Okay, but in delete you what data you want to delete. There are many data in the database, so you have to pass an ID here. Okay, suppose you have to delete some data and the ID, suppose the ID is 2. Okay, so the data whose ID is 2 get deleted. Okay, so this is the delete mapping. And the last but not the least, put mapping. Iterate put mapping. Put mapping. Here also you have to pass data. Because why data? Why ID? Because suppose you want to update an data whose ID is 7. So if you don't pass the ID here, so it is very difficult to know that which data you want to update. So for updating the data, you have to pass an ID. Suppose if you want to update an data whose ID is 7, then if you write the 7, then you can get the data and you can simply update it and send the data to the database on the other server. So this is the suppose you want to send update data. So suppose you enter suppose you put the ID here 7, you get the suppose you pass the ID, suppose you pass the ID 2. Okay, you will get the data of ID 2. Okay, so here you can update. Okay, name will become from laptop to camera, and the price will become suppose 20,000. Okay, so and then when you hit the send button in the URL, then you will get the you can update the data. So this is all about REST APIs. So if you want to, so if we summarize all the things in one, then you can simply say that REST API, which is also known as Representational State Transfer Application Programming Interface, is one of the most popular way to communicate to allow communication between the client and the server over the internet. Okay, so with the help of HTTP methods, get mapping, put mapping, and delete mapping, we can communicate with the other software. So in next video, I will do the practical of the. We will create a Spring project. We will create a controller. Okay, and we will test our all the API that all the APIs are working properly or not. After that, we will create service layer, repository layer, and we will do a CRUD operation. Okay, so I think you all understand that all the things that I have discussed in this video. So thank you. Let's meet you in our next video. So thank you.